This episode of the Wolf of All Streets podcast was recorded in person in Singapore at Token 2049 and is proudly brought to you by the Aptos Foundation.
Yeah, and you found an industry that is arguably the most decentralized industry on the planet already.
But yeah, really it needs to start at the winery.
How do you know all these MBA guys?
Because they love wine and I'm a wine guy. They don't have any idea who's drinking their wine. When you open a $50 bottle of wine, it was made 10 years ago by somebody 10,000 miles away. You got $1 million wine collection, you can't insure it.
Take a loan against it, pay a low interest rate, and never sell.
That's dope.
I found out about dVIN from my friend Raoul Pal.
Yeah.
And he obviously is a huge wine enthusiast, and every time you see him on camera, he's having it. Incredible idea that you're building. I mean, better than me giving the pitch and sort of the background. Maybe you could just give us the quick TLDR on what you're building and why.
Sure. So we're building the universal protocol to put wine on chain. With the idea being, it's a giant asset class.
$1 trillion, right?
It's about $1 trillion worth of wine in the world at any given time. And about 600-700 billion of that is luxury, investment grade, collectible, rare wine. So it's a big asset class but it doesn't really enjoy any of the benefits of any other asset, right? Like there's no price transparency. You can't really insure it. You can't borrow against it. There's no real easy access to trade it or to buy it. The liquidity is very dispersed. And we think by tokenizing, creating a protocol to tokenize the whole industry, it brings unified liquidity into this $1 trillion asset class.
Let's not take for granted that the people listening don't really know what it means to tokenize this industry. Yeah. They're thinking, how do I take something I'm drinking and turn it into technology? So maybe explain more what that actually means, because this is tokenization of real world assets. It's decentralized physical infrastructure. You got all the big things that are being built sort of in one project here.
Yeah. Well, so look, it's really simple. We've developed a series of smart contracts and mechanisms to put an individual bottle of wine on chain as an asset, which essentially kind of turns a bottle of wine from a possession, meaning like I have a bottle of wine, I give it to you, now it's your bottle of wine, into an asset where there's a ledger that says who owns that bottle. And by having that ledger and having that chain of ownership or having a deed of ownership over a bottle, now that bottle becomes an asset and you can do kind of interesting things with it. So there's a bunch of different elements to this. One of them, if anybody's seen like the movie Sour Grapes, about like the guy that was forging or counterfeiting, millions and millions of dollars worth of wine. So anti-counterfeit and anti-fraud authenticity, that's a really important piece of it. Like if you have a registry of ownership, then you know who owns every bottle and you're not going to buy a fake bottle, right? You're not, because you know who owns it. So that's like an important element. But then there's also chain of custody, there's provenance, there's consumption, there's data, like supply chain data, super important to the wine industry. Even loyalty. One of the biggest problems in the wine industry is the cost to acquire a new customer, the CAC, is incredibly high. It costs in Napa about $450 to acquire a new customer in the luxury wine industry. And that's because they're not allowed to advertise, right?
Right.
Like nobody listening to this has ever seen an advertisement for luxury wine.
It's true.
They don't advertise on television. They're not allowed to advertise on social media. So like imagine having a business where you're not allowed to advertise. You don't know who your customers are. Your customers are usually consuming your product 10 years after it leaves you, after you produce it. And you don't have any idea like how to manage your product development, product mix, marketing, messaging, packaging, your supply chain, like how do I make my supply chain more efficient? How do I get feedback from my customers? You have none of that. So $1 trillion asset class, $100 billion a year in turnover just for the luxury industry, and they're doing it with no data, no information.
To fight counterfeiting,
Yeah.
and to understand the provenance, doesn't this have to start at the actual winery?
Yeah.
Seems like a huge challenge for you because you just can't 10 years later slap a tag on the bottle and say this is real.
Well, so we definitely start at the winery, and we've already done pilot programs over the course of the last couple of years with about 70 wineries from around the world. So we've got a pretty good relationship with a lot of kind of high-end luxury wineries. But yeah, really it needs to start at the winery. But there's kind of a little bit of a cheat code, right? So most of the time, in most of the world, if you buy a bottle of investment grade or luxury wine, you typically don't have it delivered to your house, right? It goes into a bonded warehouse. It goes directly from the winery to a bonded warehouse. And there's, at least $100-200 billion worth of wine that has never left what we call a trusted custodian.
Right.
So
the owner changes, but it doesn't physically change hands in any manner.
Exactly right. So it's fairly easy for us to go in and not just tokenize wines from the winemaker, although that's really the biggest hurdle for us. But that's where we're going. But we can also go to all of these bonded warehouses. We can go to Sotheby's. We can go to lots of places where they're a trusted custodian. They have wines that came directly from the winemaker, and we can tokenize those wines.
It's so interesting when you start to think about collateralizing these assets, right? Because listen, that's the billionaire playbook, right? Is to gather things, take a loan against it, pay a low interest rate, and never sell.
And when you think about that, like there's a lot of people out there with $500,000 wine cellars, $1 million wine cellars, and they can't do any of that. They can't. Not only can they not collateralize it, they can't insure it.
Right.
You can't get insurance. You got $1 million wine collection, you can't insure it. Like once you tokenize it, there's a lot of interesting things that you can do. But that's at the consumer level. Like there's actually a really interesting play that we've been talking to a bunch of credit, like on-chain credit providers. So, for example, winemakers in Barolo in Italy, they're required by local regulations to age their wine in barrel for 4 years and in bottle for 4 years before they can sell it. So every one of those winemakers has 8 years worth of inventory that they're holding on to, that they're not allowed to sell. Well, if you go and look at their books,
how do you have that runway?
That's a liability
Yeah,
because they can't sell it, but they have to pay. But they're paying for storage. If you tokenize it becomes an asset. You can borrow against it. You can sell futures. You can hedge against it. Like there's a lot of things that you can do, and a lot of really interesting opportunities for winemakers. And like that's just Barolo. When you think about that asset class, you're looking at hundreds of billions of dollars worth of wine.
You basically answered it. It was going to be my next question, and how this actually works for the winemakers. I mean, effectively, this can be fundraising throughout the process.
So we've done that for a couple of winemakers. We work with. We did a really interesting project with Carmelo Anthony when he launched his new the Seventh Estate. It's a tiny little winery in Châteauneuf-du-Pape. But we also did something with Tony Parker, which was really interesting. A bunch of NBA players obviously really love wine. So Tony Parker has a little winery in Avignon. And we did a really interesting project with him called an allocation token. So he makes a very, very small amount of very high-end red wine. And instead of like making the wine and then trying to sell it in the market, what we sold was an allocation token, which is a really simple token that gives people the right to buy up to 12 bottles a year. So he was able to fundraise to basically sell that token, sell the future distribution of that wine, create the winery, put a bunch of improvements into the winery, build the brand, and now he's got a couple thousand people that are buying 12 bottles a year, sells out every year. He knows exactly who's going to get his wine every year. And we're doing actually an event in, I think it's October 22nd, where he's doing the first pickup party at his house in Texas. So like if you have the allocation token, You can go to Tony Parker's house, pick up your wine. He does a barbecue. It's really fun
How do you know all these MBA guys?
because they love wine, and I'm a wine guy, right? So like, I also did a bunch of television projects. I do subject matter expert for wine TV, wine documentaries. I've done some pretty interesting stuff there.
Are there regulatory challenges to doing this? Are you limited to what you can do in different jurisdictions versus others, or?
So wine is one of the most heavily regulated products in the world. But luckily, what we're doing, I mean, they've been doing it for years, right? So Berry Brothers and Rudd, which is a bonded warehouse in London, they've been, taking wine directly from the winemaker, storing it for customers, trading it between customers. It's not a token, but it's a contract.
Right.
And they've been basically doing the same thing for a long time. This is really the same thing. So I don't think we're going to face a lot of regulatory challenges, but, probably the same as anybody else. With regards to like shipping wine and moving wine around the world, we never take possession of any
Right.
wine. So that's not really what we do. We work with a bunch of different logistics providers. I think sooner or later, what you're going to see is every bottle is tokenized, and every time that bottle changes custody, that's updated on chain, which is actually kind of a really interesting problem that we're solving. Another interesting problem that we're solving.
Is that your own chain?
No, so we're built on Solana.
Right.
But actually, one of the things that we're going to announce this week is we just took a strategic investment from the inventors of RFID. So RFID was invented about 25 years ago by a couple of PhD researchers at Cambridge University. And they formed a company. They've made their first strategic investment in us with the idea of building a dVIN that'll track wine all around the world. So an RFID sticker on the bottle. Every time the bottle goes from winemaker to importer to distributor to retailer, an RFID interrogator that's paid for with VinCoin can track that bottle all the way through the supply chain. So when you get the bottle at the end of the supply chain, you can look and be like, oh yeah, I know that bottle was properly stored, properly transported with the right temperature and humidity conditions. So this bottle's going to be good. 1 in 10 bottles that you open that's a luxury bottle is spoiled in some way. Either it's corked, maybe it was stored incorrectly, and you're pouring it out. In $100 billion a year industry, that's a $10 billion a year problem.
Yeah.
That we can solve with a pretty simple dVIN.
Okay, so you talked about the token.
Oh yeah.
Obviously, that has to be a huge aspect of what you're building here.
So VinCoin that we're launching on Saturday. It's pretty exciting at Breakpoint. So VinCoin is really a way to create incentives for adoption inside the wine industry. And how it works in the beginning is really simple. It's like air miles, right? The winemaker attaches VinCoin to the bottle. The bottle makes its way through the supply chain. And when the consumer opens the bottle, they get VinCoin. They get status with the winemaker. They get rewards, like maybe a winemaker dinner, and they get VinCoin. It's kind of like air miles. And they can use that to buy more wine or to pay for wine experiences. But it's a great way for the winemaker to incentivize the consumer. But what the winemaker gets in exchange for the VinCoin is data. The most important thing to know about the wine industry is that they don't have any idea who's drinking their wine, right? When you open a $50 bottle of wine, it was made 10 years ago by somebody 10,000 miles away, right? They don't know who you are. They don't have any connection with you at all. And what that means is that they don't have any way to effectively make decisions. There's no business intelligence for whether it's product development, product mix, marketing, messaging, packaging.
Sell you another bottle.
Right. Like they
Literally can't sell you another bottle.
So
it's so archaic.
So that little transaction that happens when you open the bottle, you get your VinCoin, and they get to know where and when that bottle was open, which gives them great information, great business intelligence. But also, if you opt in, they get to know who you are. They can sell you another bottle. They can offer you like a cool experience. We did this really great project with Graham's Port, which is one of the oldest wine companies in the world. They re-released their 1970 port. It's $1,000 bottle of wine. It's amazing, right? 50-year-old bottle of port. So if you bought that bottle, when you open the bottle and you share it with friends, up to 5 people that you share it with, everybody gets what's called a tasting token, right? Which is this authentic proof of experience. I've tasted from that bottle. Well, anybody that has one of those tokens can take the token, can go to Graham's Port. They get a tour of the winery. They get to have lunch at their Michelin star restaurant, and they get to taste from a barrel of their birth year, right? Wow. Like, that's an experience that you can't pay for, right? Like, you just can't. It would cost 500 euros if you wanted to pay for it. That's it's for Grams, it's a really great way for them to identify the next
super fan. I mean, it's a super fan. It's the customer who's going to join the club and come back and visit every few years with their friends when they have an anniversary.
Exactly right.
For anyone, that I've been to Napa so many times in Sonoma, and it's always because somebody's going back to the one winery that they loved for their 40th birthday, or their 50th birthday, or something like that. And to your point, that could be 100 times bigger with this level of data.
Yeah, imagine how that would work. Like, right now, the average customer acquisition cost in Napa Valley is $450.
It's crazy. I mean, that's a crazy number.
By putting VinCoin on a bottle, $10.
Yeah.
$15 maybe.
So how do you know the 5 people that tasted it? Does everybody physically scan it from a wallet?
You can scan it, you can tap it. Like there's a bunch of different ways. You can do it with a QR code, you can do it with NFC and tap. Like, we do it with NFC. So you tap the bottle, you get your token. It's like, takes 2 seconds. It's really easy. We've designed the interface to look a lot like, your Delta SkyMiles app,
that's what
and a lot less like a liquid staking app, right? Like, it's a super simple, like,
grandma can use it. The
exactly
old meme.
And when you think about the wine industry, right, luxury industry, that's 3 billion bottles a year. So what we're doing with dVIN and with VinCoin is bringing, millions or hundreds of millions of people around the world that are wine collectors, wine enthusiasts, wine investors, and bringing them onto the blockchain without them even knowing.
You keep talking about the luxury wine market.
Yeah.
When did we see this on, Trader Joe's $3 chuck?
No, maybe someday. I really think that people are going to be much more inclined to use the software on wines that they consider to be, rare, interesting, wines that are like a special occasion. And I don't care who you are. You open a $50 bottle of wine, it's a special occasion, right? And like, that's still, it's a, $100 billion a year. I don't know, maybe it'll make it to $2 chuck.
So what would you consider this operating at scale? Like, where the whole industry, you mentioned you've talked to 70 wineries.
Yeah.
How many wineries are there in the world?
So there's about 30,000 wineries in the world, which is actually one of the reasons that it's so interesting, right? Like, there's 6 companies in the world that control the whole food supply, right?
Of course.
And like 5 or 6 that control banking, and 5 or 6 that control retail. Wine is still completely atomized. 30,000 independent winemakers around the world. 10 million independent middlemen. When you're buying a $50 bottle of wine, you're not buying it from Walmart. You're buying it from like the little guy in the corner that probably keeps his inventory on like a clipboard. Right?
Yeah, literally writes it down in a ledger.
That's why there's no data going back and forth between like that little retailer or that little restaurant and the winemaker. So what we're doing is we're using the blockchain to take this decentralized industry and get them the data that they need, the customer acquisition that they need, the business intelligence that they need to really compete in the world.
It's incredible because crypto natives always talk about a decentralized future, and you found an industry that is arguably the most decentralized industry on the planet already.
Right. And when I started building this, I'm a wine guy, right? I've been in the wine industry for 20 years. I've been focused on data from the beginning because my origins were in tech. But in kind of looking at this, I always wanted to kind of solve the data problem. Like, that was always the big problem that I wanted to solve. But the more we get into it, the more I learn about smart contracts, the more I learn about digital currencies and digital transactions. We started really looking at the supply chain. And so if you look at most international transactions in the world are one Fortune 500 company buying $5 million worth of raw materials from another Fortune 500 company, right? Like that's your typical international transaction. In the wine industry, the typical international transaction is a little tiny winemaker in France selling 5 cases of wine to a little tiny importer in Norway, right? It's a $2,000 transaction. But that $2,000 transaction is incredibly inefficient, right? It's a little tiny players, so there's counterparty risk. How do I know you're going to send me the wine? How do I know you're going to send me the money? It's like textbook case for a smart contract.
Right.
But then also, when you look at that transaction, the international wire fees that the importer's paying for a $2,000 transaction, hugely inefficient.
Shipping.
The winemaker, like they're suffering what 5-day international transfer delays, right? Settlement delays. They're paying the worst FX rate. So like that little transaction, we did a study with Deloitte last year, and on a $50 bottle of wine, $6.10 is paying for bank fees and counterparty risk.
That doesn't even count packaging, the employee that. So how do these guys make money?
It's crazy. So like you open the bottle, the first glass that you pour is going to your banker, right? Like that's horrible. That's not the way to run a business. So we think that there's actually a really interesting opportunity to take the entire industry and move it on chain so that those transactions are happening on chain instead of through the traditional bank.
Do you have to go to every single winery and pitch them on this? Like that's what I'm saying. How do you get to the scale
really.
Where it's...
So we work really closely with Deloitte. I don't think that we're going to like go to wineries and get them to like sign up for a phantom wallet and buy a bunch of crypto, right? Like that's not going to happen.
Right.
But if we can work with Deloitte Winery Solutions, they work with about 30% of the industry, and they're already doing the professional services for them, right? They're installing the ERP systems, the accounting systems, the CRM, the direct consumer platform.
So you just become a part of that.
So we just get plugged directly into that, right? Like it's an API so that when the winery is generating an invoice, instead of making like a PDF that they email, they're creating a smart contract. And the importer, instead of like connecting their bank account with Plaid, they're just using either something from Amazon Managed Blockchain or something from Deloitte, and they're just on-ramping to a digital currency. That transaction is happening instantly, and the winemaker's off-ramping. And like nobody even knows that they're using crypto, right? They're making a digital transaction. It's more efficient, it's safer, it's better.
And the token, I assume, will trade itself in the free market.
Exactly. Yeah. We're launching on Jupiter. We're really excited to be partnered with Jupiter. Really excited to be working with Solana. Anyone that comes to Breakpoint is getting, I don't know if you heard about this, but we're doing the biggest liquid airdrop in history. So we brought 4,000 bottles of champagne.
It's like literally a liquid airdrop.
Right? So we're doing this super cool project with Mad Lads. Every Mad Lad, we're airdropping a bottle of champagne with their unique lad as the front label.
Wow.
Super cool. So then with that bottle, shipping everywhere in the world for free. So we're really kind of showing, not telling, like exactly how VinCoin works.
It's really happening.
Yeah.
We've had every cycle, it's these ideas, dPIN, RWA. We talked about at the beginning, right? These are catchphrases. And you wonder if we're always too early and when it's going to come to fruition, but this is happening. It's going to be a very long process.
Yeah.
But this is really happening for you.
We've charted out a 25-year course, right? In the wine industry, we think about things generationally.
Right, of course.
Right? When I plant vines, I'm planting them because for wine that my kids are going to drink, right? Like it usually takes 25 years or so for when you plant vines for that vine to be making the very best wine, growing the best grapes that are making the best wine. And then that wine typically has to be stored, aged for 10 or 15 years. So like the vines that I'm planting today, they're for my kids. And when I think about what we're doing with VinCoin and with the dVIN protocol, like that's really for, the real benefits are going to be for the next generation. That's okay. Like we've got a long-term plan. We're going to bring thousands and thousands of wineries onto the platform and millions of wine lovers from around the world.
I think that makes you a bit of a unicorn.
Yeah.
20-year plus plan in crypto.
Yeah. Well, Yeah, probably a little bit. That's okay. Like in the wine industry, that's how we think about things, right? Like you think about things generationally, and you have to.
Yeah. So you sort of answered it, but what's the grandest vision? Full level of mainstream adoption. You're on every collectible, investable bottle of wine in the world. Do you expand beyond wine?
Look, maybe my kids do, right?
Right.
But look, I think that's 3 billion bottles a year. And like most of those bottles are going to be aged for an average of 4 years. So 12 billion bottles of wine that exist in the world that are tokenized, that's a big business. And I'm really excited about that. And I think that wine is pretty unique. A lot of people ask us about whiskey. People ask us about watches. They ask us about tokenizing, lots of other stuff. I think that's interesting. And I think there are lots of companies that are specialized in doing those products. I think wine it's really unique. It's one of the very few industries where there's this gap between purchase and consumption that doesn't exist anywhere else, right? Like if you buy a t-shirt, you wear it the next day. If you buy a car, you drive it home off the lot. If you buy a great bottle of wine, that's like 5 to 10 years before you consume it. And so that gap, it's really unique. There's no other industry that has that. We're going to work really hard to solve that, to get the best data to the winemakers, to create the best experiences and safer experience for consumers. And I think we're going to build something really great inside the wine industry.
I mean, speaking to the audience on the street, right, which is one of the largest TradFi media platforms in the world, 30 million boomers with $1 million plus portfolios. This may be the single most obvious use case of crypto that they would understand.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, just think about being able to prove, like, all these guys that like drink a lot of great wine. Think about if you were able to prove this is the wine that I drink, and being able to go to like Chateau Petrus or Chateau Palmer and be like, hey, I'm one of your best customers. You didn't know that because I'm so disconnected from you, but I'm a great customer. Like, I want to come and do a barrel tasting. I want to come and do a winemaker dinner. I want to come and like hang out for a harvest experience. Like, that's the kind of thing that you can start to do now that you've tokenized the wine. You can actually have an authentic proof of experience or authentic proof of ownership.
Well, it's incredible. Congratulations on all the success so far, and I can't wait to see in 25 years when you've tokenized every bottle of wine in the world.
I appreciate it, man.
Thank you, David.